The dust kicked up around her worn boots as Beatrice Delaney collapsed onto the wooden steps of the mercantile, her shoulders shaking with sobs that she tried desperately to muffle behind her hands. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the main street of Oro Blanco, Arizona. And the year was 1883, a time when debt could crush a person as thoroughly as the desert heat could wring every drop of moisture from the earth. She had nowhere left to turn, no one left to ask for help, and the creditor had made it abundantly clear that morning that he would take everything her late father had built unless she paid the full amount by week's end. Zachary Morrison had been riding through town with no particular destination in mind when he spotted her there, crumpled against the storefront like a wildflower beaten down by a sudden storm. Something in the way she held herself, the defeated curve of her spine mixed with a defiant tilt to her chin, even as tears streamed down her face, made him pull his horse to a stop. He was a tall man, 26 years old, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water after a rain, and he had seen enough hardship in his years working cattle drives and ranch work to recognize genuine despair when he saw it. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked, swinging down from his saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot. Beatrice looked up sharply, her blue eyes wide and red-rimmed, her blonde hair escaping from its pins in wisps that stuck to her damp cheeks. She was 22 years old and had been managing her father's small ranch alone for the past 8 months since his death, and the weight of it was crushing her. "I am fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the words, giving lie to the statement. Zachary crouched down beside her, his hat in his hands, giving her space but making it clear he was not leaving. "With all due respect, miss, you do not look fine. Is there something I can help with?" She wanted to say no, wanted to maintain her pride and send this stranger on his way, but the words tumbled out instead. "My father died last winter. He had debts I did not know about. The man who holds the notes, Thomas Garrett, he came to see me this morning. He says I owe $2,000 by Friday or he takes the ranch, the cattle, everything. I do not have that kind of money. I have been selling what I can, but it is not enough, and he knows it. He knows I cannot pay, and he wants the land. There is water on my property, you see, and he has been trying to buy it for years." The amount was staggering, more than most working people saw in 5 years. Zachary felt anger kindle in his chest at the thought of some rich man using debt to steal from a grieving woman. "How much do you have?" $300. That is everything I could scrape together. It might as well be 3 cents for all the good it will do me." He studied her face, taking in the determined set of her jaw beneath the tears, the calloused hands that spoke of hard work, the simple but clean dress that had been mended multiple times. This was not a woman looking for an easy way out or someone to solve all her problems. This was someone who had been fighting with everything she had and was simply being crushed by circumstances beyond her control. "Where is your ranch?" he asked. "About 5 miles west of town." "Why?" "I would like to see it if you will show me. And I would like to hear more about these debts and this Garrett fellow." Beatrice wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, confused by this stranger's interest. "I do not understand. Why would you care about any of this?" Zachary stood and offered her his hand, pulling her gently to her feet when she took it. "Because I have some money saved, and I know what it is like to lose everything through no fault of your own, and because no man should be able to steal someone's home by hiding behind pieces of paper. Come on, let me buy you something to eat and you can tell me the whole story." They walked to the small restaurant at the end of the street, Zachary leading his horse by the reins. Over plates of beef and beans that Beatrice barely touched, she told him everything. Her father, William Delaney, had borrowed money 3 years ago to buy more cattle during a drought, expecting to pay it back when prices recovered. But the drought had lasted longer than anyone anticipated, and then her father had taken ill. By the time he died, the debt had grown with interest and penalties, until it had become this monstrous thing that Beatrice could not possibly overcome alone. "Garrett holds all the notes?" Zachary asked, his food forgotten as he listened intently. "Yes. He bought them from the bank about 6 months ago. My father had been making small payments, but after he died, I could barely keep up with the interest, let alone reduce the principal. Garrett kept adding fees, late charges, things I never fully understood. This morning he told me the grace period was over, full payment or foreclosure. And you are sure the amount is legitimate? $2,000. Beatrice pulled a crumpled paper from her pocket, smoothing it on the table between them. Zachary studied it carefully, his jaw tightening as he read. The original debt had been $800. The rest was interest compounded at a rate that seemed deliberately designed to make repayment impossible, plus a litany of mysterious fees and charges. "This is not right," he said flatly. "Some of these charges make no sense. This one here for property assessment that is not standard for this kind of loan, and this interest rate, it is higher than the territorial law allows." Hope flickered in Beatrice's chest for the first time in months. "Are you certain? My father was a lawyer before he died. He made sure I could read contracts and legal documents. This Garrett has been cheating you, adding things that are not enforceable. The real debt is probably closer to $1,200, maybe less. But how do I prove that? Garrett has lawyers' connections. I am just a woman alone trying to hold onto a failing ranch." Zachary folded the paper carefully and handed it back to her. "First, show me your ranch. Then we will figure out what to do about Garrett." They rode out together, Beatrice on her father's old mare and Zachary on his buckskin gelding. The ranch was small but well maintained, with a sturdy house that William Delaney had built with his own hands, corrals in good repair, and a natural spring that bubbled up from the ground and fed into a clear stream. Zachary could see immediately why Garrett wanted this land. Water was gold in Arizona territory, and this property had it in abundance. "How many head of cattle do you have?" he asked as they walked the property. 43. I had to sell some to raise the $300. Before my father died, we had close to 90. "And you have been managing all of this alone?" Beatrice bristled slightly at the question, hearing doubt where perhaps none was intended. "I grew up on this ranch. My father taught me everything about running it. I can rope and brand and deliver a calf as well as any man. The problem is not that I cannot do the work. The problem is that one person cannot do the work of 3, and I cannot afford to hire help when every penny goes to trying to pay down an impossible debt." Zachary held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I meant no offense. I can see you have kept this place running despite everything. That takes skill and strength. I am impressed, truly." The sincerity in his voice took the wind out of her defensive anger. She softened, feeling suddenly exhausted. "I am sorry. I am not usually so prickly. It has just been a very difficult time. You have nothing to apologize for." He looked around at the land, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the way the afternoon light turned everything golden. "This is a good place, worth fighting for. But how do I fight a man like Garrett? He has money and power. I have nothing." Zachary turned to face her fully, and the determination in his eyes made her breath catch. "You have someone who is willing to help now. I have $1,700 saved from years of working cattle drives. It is everything I have, but I do not need it the way you do. Let me loan you the money to pay off Garrett. We will get a proper lawyer to review those documents first and make sure you are only paying what is legally owed." Then you can pay me back over time, at a fair rate, no tricks." Beatrice stared at him as if he had started speaking a foreign language. "You cannot be serious. You do not even know me. Why would you give me everything you have saved?" "Because it is the right thing to do. Because I have been watching you since we got here, and I can see how much you love this place. Because my father always taught me that the measure of a man is what he does when someone needs help, and there is nothing in it for him." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "And maybe because I would like to get to know you better, and it is hard to do that when you are being thrown off your land." She laughed despite herself, a watery sound that was half sob. "You are either the kindest man I have ever met or completely insane. Perhaps a bit of both." They stood there as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Beatrice felt something shifting inside her, a weight beginning to lift that she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "Why would you do this?" she asked again, needing to understand. "Really?" Zachary was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. 5 years ago, my family had a ranch in New Mexico. Not big, but it was ours. My father got sick and we could not keep up with everything. A man like your Garrett, he came in and made promises about helping, about loans to tide us over. By the time my father died and we saw the actual terms, we were trapped. We lost everything. I watched my mother break under the weight of it, watched her give up. She died a year later, just stopped trying. I swore then that if I ever had the means to help someone else in that situation, I would. So here I am." Beatrice felt tears welling up again, but these were different from the ones she had shed on the mercantile steps. These came from a place of overwhelming gratitude and something else, something warm and unfamiliar that was taking root in her chest. "If you do this, I will pay you back. Every cent. I swear it." "I know you will. But first, let us go see a lawyer and find out exactly what you really owe." The next morning they met with Samuel Peterson, the only lawyer in Oro Blanco who was not connected to Garrett's business interests. Peterson was a thin man in his 50s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He studied the loan documents for a long time, making notes and occasionally shaking his head. "This is predatory lending at its finest," he finally said. "Half of these charges are not enforceable under territorial law. The interest rate exceeds the legal maximum. If we challenge this in court, I believe we can get the total amount reduced to no more than $900, possibly less." "But that would take time," Beatrice said. "Time I do not have. Garrett wants his money by Friday." Peterson leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his desk. "There is another option. We could go to Garrett with this information, show him that we know his loan is not legal, and offer to settle for a reasonable amount immediately. If he refuses and forces you into foreclosure, you could sue him afterward for fraud and illegal lending practices. He would stand to lose far more than the original debt. Men like Garrett usually prefer to take a smaller, certain gain rather than risk exposure and legal trouble." Zachary nodded slowly. "So we go in strong, show him we know what he has done, and offer to settle this today for the legitimate amount of the debt." "Exactly. Miss Delaney, do you know what your father actually received when he took out the original loan? $800. He used it to buy cattle from a seller in Texas. I have the bill of sale in my father's papers." "Good. That helps establish the principle. With 3 years of legal interest, the total owed should be around $950. I would recommend offering Garrett $1,000 even, as a settlement to close the matter completely. If Miss Delaney has $300 and you, Mr. Morrison, can provide $700, this can be resolved today." "I can provide whatever is needed," Zachary said firmly. They found Thomas Garrett in his office above the bank, a thick man in an expensive suit who reeked of cigar smoke and self-satisfaction. His expression soured when he saw Beatrice enter with two men flanking her. "Miss Delaney, I was not expecting you until Friday. I hope you are here to tell me you have the money." Peterson stepped forward before Beatrice could speak. "Mr. Garrett, I am Samuel Peterson, representing Miss Delaney in this matter. We are here to discuss the terms of her father's loan and resolve this situation today." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "There is nothing to discuss. The terms are clear. $2,000 by Friday or the property is forfeit." "The terms are fraudulent," Peterson said calmly, laying papers on Garrett's desk. "The interest rate exceeds territorial legal limits. These fees are not enforceable. If you attempt to foreclose, we will file suit for predatory lending practices and fraud. The territorial judge is a friend of mine, and he takes a very dim view of men who prey on widows and orphans." Garrett's face flushed red. "You cannot prove any of that." "Actually, we can. I have documented every instance where your loan terms violate the law. I have also discovered that you have done this to at least 4 other families in the past 2 years. If we go to court, all of that will come out. Your reputation, your business dealings, everything will be examined. Or you could accept a reasonable settlement today and walk away with a tidy profit on the original $800 investment." The room was silent except for the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Garrett looked from Peterson to Beatrice to Zachary, clearly trying to calculate his options. "What kind of settlement are we talking about?" he finally asked. $1,000 cash today. Full satisfaction of the debt with no further claims on the Delaney property. "That is ridiculous." "I am owed $2,000. You are owed $950 by law," Peterson corrected. "We are offering more than that to avoid the time and expense of litigation. But if you prefer, we can see you in court and you can explain to a judge why you have been charging interest rates that violate territorial statute." Zachary had remained quiet throughout this exchange, but now he stepped forward and placed a leather bag on the desk with a heavy thunk. $1,000, Mr. Garrett. Take it or leave it. But understand that if you choose to leave it, we will fight you every step of the way, and when we win, you will get nothing." Garrett stared at the bag, greed and anger warring on his face. Finally, greed won out. "I want this in writing. Full release of all debts, no further claims from either party." "Agreed," Peterson said, already pulling documents from his case. "I took the liberty of preparing the papers in advance." 30 minutes later, they walked out of Garrett's office with a signed release. Beatrice clutched the document to her chest like a lifeline, hardly daring to believe it was real. Outside, in the bright morning sun, she turned to Zachary and Peterson with tears streaming down her face. "I do not know how to thank you both. You saved my home, my life, everything." Peterson patted her shoulder kindly. "Thank Mr. Morrison here. He is the one who brought this to me and provided the funds. I just pushed some papers around." With a tip of his hat, he headed back toward his office. Beatrice and Zachary stood together on the wooden sidewalk, suddenly awkward now that the crisis had passed. The intimacy of their shared purpose had created a connection between them. But now, in the aftermath, neither was quite sure how to proceed. "I still have $700 of your dollars," Beatrice finally said. "Plus the $300 Garrett did not take. I want to pay you back as quickly as possible. There is no rush. Pay me when you can. But that money was your entire savings, your future. I cannot just take that from you." Zachary smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something warm and open. "Here is what I am thinking. You need help running that ranch if you want it to be profitable again. I need a place to work and rebuild my savings. What if I came to work for you, room and board plus a fair wage. You can pay me back out of the ranch's profits over time. We work together to build the place up, increase the herd, make it what it should be. Beatrice felt her heart begin to pound. It was a practical solution, one that made perfect sense. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something in the way her stomach flipped when he smiled, that suggested this was about more than just business. "That would be very helpful," she said carefully. "But are you sure? It is hard work and the ranch is small. There is only the one house, though there is a room that was meant for a hired hand that has its own entrance. I am sure. I have been drifting for 3 years, working other people's ranches, saving money without any real purpose. Maybe this is where I am meant to be." So Zachary Morrison moved into the small room off the back of the Delaney ranch house and became Beatrice's partner in the work of restoring her family's legacy. The first weeks were a blur of hard labor, rising before dawn to mend fences, check on cattle, clear brush, and do the 1,000 tasks that made the difference between a struggling ranch and a thriving one. They worked side by side, and Beatrice found herself constantly surprised by Zachary's competence and willingness to take direction. He never assumed he knew better than her, never dismissed her ideas or knowledge, but treated her as an equal partner in all decisions. The attraction between them grew like a seed planted in fertile soil, sending roots deep before either of them fully acknowledged what was happening. It was there in the way Zachary's hand would linger on hers when he helped her down from her horse, in the way Beatrice found herself looking for him whenever he was out of sight for too long, in the comfortable silences that fell between them as they worked side by side in the evening light. One night, about a month after Zachary had moved in, they sat together on the porch after a long day of branding calves. Beatrice had made stew for dinner, and they had eaten mostly in silence, both too tired for much conversation. Now, with the stars beginning to emerge overhead and the desert cooling around them, Zachary finally spoke. "Can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you never marry? A woman like you, with property and strength and intelligence, I would have expected suitors lining up." Beatrice laughed softly. "There were a few over the years, but most men in this territory want a wife who will stay in the house and raise babies and let them make all the decisions. When they saw that I could rope and ride and had my own opinions about how to run a ranch, they lost interest quickly. My father always said I was too independent for my own good. Your father was wrong. Your independence is one of your finest qualities." She turned to look at him in the darkness, trying to read his expression. "You really believe that?" "I do. I have never met a woman quite like you, Beatrice. You are strong without being hard, capable without losing your kindness. The way you fought to save this place, the way you kept going even when everything seemed impossible, that takes a special kind of courage." Her breath caught in her throat. They had been dancing around this attraction for weeks, both feeling it but neither willing to be the first to name it. Now, in the darkness with the day's work behind them and the future stretching uncertain before them, Beatrice found the courage to be honest. "I am glad you came into my life, Zachary Morrison. Not just because you saved my ranch, though I will always be grateful for that, but because you make me feel less alone. These past weeks, working with you, talking with you, I have been happier than I have been in a very long time." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I feel the same way. I told you I had been drifting, but it was more than that. I was lost. I had no purpose, no direction. Then I saw you crying on those steps and something clicked into place, like I had been looking for you without knowing it." "That sounds like something from a dime novel," she said, but her voice was tender, not mocking. "Maybe, but that does not make it less true. They sat there holding hands until the stars filled the sky like spilled diamonds, and when they finally went to their separate rooms, both of them lay awake for a long time, thinking about the other person just on the far side of the wall. The next morning, everything felt different. The attraction that had been unspoken now hummed between them like an electric current. They caught each other's eyes across the breakfast table and smiled. Their hands brushed as they worked together to repair a section of fence, and neither pulled away. When Zachary lifted Beatrice down from her horse after they had driven a few strays back to the main herd, he held her a moment longer than necessary, his hands firm on her waist, and she felt heat bloom in her cheeks. "Beatrice," he said softly, still holding her. "Yes. I am going to kiss you now, if that is all right with you." She answered by rising on her toes and meeting him halfway, their lips coming together with a gentleness that quickly deepened into something more urgent. His hands moved from her waist to her back, pulling her closer, and she wound her arms around his neck, losing herself in the sensation of being held, wanted, cherished. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said simply. "I probably have been since the first day, but I wanted to be sure. I am sure now." Tears pricked Beatrice's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I am falling in love with you too. I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone. I thought I would always be alone. You are not alone anymore, and if you will have me, you never will be again." They kissed again, softer this time, a promise rather than a question. Around them, the desert stretched away in all directions, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving, but they had found something precious in its midst, something worth more than all the gold hidden in the mountains, worth more than water or cattle or land. They courted properly after that, even though they lived under the same roof. Zachary brought her wildflowers from the hills and sat with her on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. Beatrice cooked his favorite meals and laughed at his stories about his cattle drive days. They went to church together in town on Sundays, and people began to talk, but it was mostly kindly gossip about how good it was to see Beatrice Delaney happy again after such a difficult year. Thomas Garrett glared at them whenever they passed, but he kept his distance, knowing that any move against them would bring Peterson down on him like a hammer. Other ranchers began to approach Beatrice with more respect, seeing that she had a capable partner now and was clearly making a success of her father's legacy. 3 months after that first kiss, Zachary proposed properly, getting down on one knee in the barn after they had finished the evening chores. He had bought a simple gold band from the jeweler in town, spending more than he could afford but wanting her to have something beautiful. "Beatrice Delaney, you are the strongest, smartest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You saved my life as surely as I helped save your ranch. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions, existing without really living. You gave me purpose and hope and a future I actually want. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of you?" She was crying again, but laughing too, and she pulled him to his feet so she could kiss him properly. "Yes, you foolish, wonderful man. Yes, I will marry you, and you do not need to prove anything to me. You already showed me who you are the day you chose to help a stranger for no reason, except that it was right." They were married in the small church in Oro Blanco on a warm October day, with half the town in attendance. Beatrice wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her, and she carried a bouquet of desert flowers that Zachary had ridden out at dawn to collect. Peterson stood as Zachary's best man, and the minister's wife stood with Beatrice, and when they exchanged vows, there was not a dry eye in the church. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. With Zachary's knowledge of cattle management and Beatrice's deep understanding of the land and water resources, they increased their herd steadily. They were careful with money, living simply and putting every spare dollar back into the ranch. Within 2 years, Beatrice had paid back the entire loan to Zachary, though by that point it was a meaningless distinction since everything they had belonged to both of them anyway. They added a room onto the house the following spring, anticipating the family they both wanted. Beatrice became pregnant that summer, and Zachary treated her like she was made of spun glass, though she laughed and told him she had no intention of stopping work just because she was carrying a baby. Their first child was born in March of 1887, a healthy boy with his mother's blonde hair and his father's creek water eyes. They named him William after Beatrice's father, and Zachary held his son with shaking hands and tears running down his face, overwhelmed by the reality of this new life they had created together. "He is perfect," Beatrice whispered from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "We made something perfect." "We made everything perfect," Zachary corrected, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "This life, this family, this ranch, all of it. You gave me everything, Beatrice, everything that matters." Thomas Garrett died of a heart attack 2 years later, and his business affairs were investigated by territorial authorities following complaints from several other families he had cheated. His estate was forced to make restitution, and Beatrice received an additional $300 as compensation for his fraudulent lending practices. She used the money to buy a young breeding bull, improving their herd's bloodlines. When William was 3, Beatrice gave birth to twin girls, Grace and Ruby, who had their father's dark hair and their mother's fierce independence. The house was chaos and joy, full of children's laughter and the endless work of raising a family on a working ranch. Zachary hired 2 steady hands to help with the cattle, and Beatrice managed the books and the horses, and together they built something that neither of them could have achieved alone. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, they sat together on the same porch where they had first admitted their feelings for each other, watching their 3 children play in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains. William was teaching his little sisters how to make lassos out of old rope, and their serious concentration was amusing to watch. "You remember that day I found you crying on the mercantile steps?" Zachary asked, his arm around Beatrice's shoulders. "How could I forget? It was the worst day of my life, until it became the beginning of the best part of my life. I had no idea when I stopped to help you that I was really helping myself, that you would become my whole world." Beatrice leaned into him, content and complete in a way she had never imagined possible during those dark days when she thought she would lose everything. "We saved each other, I think. You lifted the burden of debt from me, but I gave you a home and a purpose. We both got exactly what we needed." "And a lot more than we expected," Zachary added, gesturing to their children. "That too." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple, watching their children play and thinking about the unlikely path that had brought them to this moment. Beatrice thought about her father, hoping he could see what she had made of the legacy he left her, how she had fought for it and preserved it and grown it into something even better. She thought about that day she had sat crying, certain her whole world was ending, unable to imagine that salvation would come in the form of a stranger on horseback with kind eyes and a generous heart. Zachary thought about the years he had spent drifting, working jobs that meant nothing, saving money without any real goal, feeling like a ship without an anchor. He thought about the random chance that had brought him through Oro Blanco on that particular day, at that particular time, and how easily he could have ridden past without stopping. He thought about the life he might have lived if he had not chosen to help, and he was grateful beyond words that he had made a different choice. Little William came running up to the porch then, his sisters trailing behind him. "Papa, Mama, come see. I can rope the fence post 3 times in a row now." Zachary stood and swung his son up onto his shoulders. "Show me, Cowboy. Let us see what you can do." Beatrice followed, scooping up Ruby while Grace clung to her skirt, and together the family walked out into the yard as the stars began to emerge. The ranch stretched around them, solid and real and theirs, bought with struggle and saved by love and grown through hard work and partnership. The burdens that had once seemed insurmountable were just memories now, lessons learned and obstacles overcome. In their place was this rich, full life, noisy and chaotic and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. The debt that had threatened to destroy Beatrice's world had instead brought Zachary into it, and from that crisis had bloomed a love story that would last the rest of their lives. As Zachary helped his son perfect his roping technique and Beatrice laughed at the twins' attempts to copy their brother, she sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving for second chances and kind strangers and the unexpected ways that life could transform heartbreak into joy. For the cowboy who had stopped when he could have ridden on, who had given everything when he had no reason to, who had seen her at her lowest moment and chosen to stay. The desert wind blew warm around them, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of another good day tomorrow. The ranch was prosperous, the children were healthy, and the love between husband and wife was a living, growing thing that strengthened with each passing year. Everything that had once seemed lost had been found again, better and more precious for having been almost taken away. Years passed, and the Morrison Ranch became known throughout Arizona Territory as a model of successful ranching. William grew into a fine young man who loved the land as much as his parents did, and the twins were wild as mustangs, able to ride and rope almost as well as their older brother by the time they were teenagers. Beatrice's hair gained threads of silver, and Zachary's face showed the lines of a life spent outdoors, but the love in their eyes when they looked at each other never dimmed. They added more children to their family as the years went on, 2 more boys who were born with their father's height and their mother's determination. The house expanded again, and the ranch grew to nearly 300 head of cattle. They bought more land when an adjacent property came up for sale, and the spring that had first attracted Thomas Garrett's greed now fed irrigation ditches that turned patches of desert into productive pasture. On Beatrice's 45th birthday, Zachary surprised her with a new barn, built by their sons and the ranch hands, with her initials carved above the door. She cried when she saw it, not from sadness but from the overwhelming sense of how far they had come, how much they had built together from that desperate day when she had thought her world was ending. "You never cease to amaze me," she told him that night, curled against his side in their bed. "After all these years, you still find ways to make me feel cherished. That is because you are cherished. You are the foundation of everything good in my life. I never want you to forget that. How could I forget when you show me every single day?" Their children married and had children of their own, and Beatrice and Zachary became grandparents multiple times over. William took over more of the day-to-day ranch operations, though his parents still rode out most mornings to check on things and offer advice when asked. The twins both married well, Grace to a schoolteacher from Tucson and Ruby to a young lawyer who reminded Beatrice of Samuel Peterson. The younger boys were still finding their way, but they were good kids with strong values and a deep respect for the work their parents had done. On their 30th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were grandchildren everywhere, running and shouting and getting into everything, and the house was full of noise and love and the smell of good food. As Beatrice looked around at all the faces, all the people who existed because she and Zachary had found each other on a desperate day in Oro Blanco, she felt her throat tighten with emotion. Zachary found her standing by the window, watching the chaos with a soft smile on her face. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything. Nothing. How lucky we are, how easily all of this might never have happened if things had gone differently that day." But things did not go differently. I saw you when you needed help, and I helped you, and we fell in love. That is what happened, and we have spent 30 years building on that foundation. Do you ever regret it? Giving up everything you had saved, tying your life to mine when you barely knew me? Zachary turned her gently to face him, his hands cupping her face with the same tenderness he had shown the first time he kissed her all those years ago. "Not for one single second. That money was just paper, Beatrice. What I got in return was a life worth living. You, our children, this ranch, this family, all of it. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." She kissed him then, long and sweet, and their children cheered and the grandchildren made disgusted noises, and they broke apart laughing. As the sun set on that anniversary celebration, casting long shadows across the land that they had fought so hard to keep, Beatrice Delaney Morrison reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From despair to hope, from loneliness to love, from the edge of losing everything to having more than she had ever dreamed possible. The burden that had once crushed her had been lifted by a cowboy with a kind heart and a generous spirit, and together they had built a legacy that would endure for generations. The debt was long since paid, not just in money but in the life they had created together. Every fence post, and every calf and every meal shared, and every quiet evening on the porch had been a payment towards something far more valuable than any financial obligation. They had paid their debt to each other in loyalty and partnership and unwavering love, and the return on that investment was immeasurable. As darkness fell and the party continued inside, Zachary and Beatrice slipped out to the porch one more time, drawn by habit and by the need for a quiet moment together. They sat in the same chairs they had occupied for 3 decades, their hands intertwined, their souls intertwined even more deeply. "I love you," Beatrice said simply, the words holding 30 years of meaning. "I love you too. Always have, always will." The stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, that had watched over their wedding, that had shone down on the births of their children and the growth of their dreams. The desert breathed around them, ancient and eternal, and the ranch settled into nighttime silence, secure and prosperous, and filled with the evidence of a life well lived. Inside, their family laughed and talked and celebrated, all of them owing their existence to a moment of compassion on a dusty street, to a choice made by a cowboy who had seen someone in pain and decided to help. That single act of kindness had rippled out through time, creating lives and love and a legacy that would continue long after both of them were gone. And that, Beatrice thought as she sat there with her husband's hand in hers and her family safe around her, was the true miracle. Not that Zachary had saved her ranch, but that in saving it, he had found his home. That in lifting her burden, he had found his purpose. That in helping a stranger, he had discovered his soulmate. The story that had begun with tears ended with joy, and the debt that had threatened to destroy everything had instead become the catalyst for creation. They had taken the worst moment of Beatrice's life and transformed it into the foundation of something beautiful and lasting, and that transformation was the real triumph. As they sat together under the Arizona stars, surrounded by the land they loved and the family they had built, Beatrice and Zachary Morrison knew they had found what everyone searches for but few truly discover. They had found each other at exactly the right moment, when both of them needed saving, and they had spent the rest of their lives being grateful for that gift. The ranch would continue after them, passed down to children and grandchildren who would tell the story of how it had almost been lost, and how it had been saved by love and courage and a stranger's kindness. The spring would keep flowing, the cattle would keep grazing, and the house would keep sheltering generations of Morrisons, who would grow up knowing that their family legacy was built on more than land and livestock. It was built on the unshakable foundation of two people who had loved each other completely, who had faced every challenge together, and who had proven that sometimes the greatest burdens become the greatest blessings in disguise.